Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into vlog number 14 where we wrap up one of the last sessions for 2021 in Las Vegas. For this one, we'll be reviewing hands from a 2-5 session played at Caesar's Palace. We kick off hand number 1 with the action already underway and buy into the game for the table maximum of 500. Before we get an opportunity to set up the camera, we find ourselves with King Queen of Diamonds on the button and 3-betting our opponent to 45 after she initially opens to 15 in middle position. I don't usually make it a habit to start off aggressive at the table with a bunch of unknowns, but in this case, a quick scout around the table while we went to get our trips from the cage changed my mind. I don't see a lot of vloggers do this, so let's do a brief assessment of the table as that concept of knowing your customer, which I mentioned in episode 13, is always important. I'm probably oversimplifying things here, but here's a few observations I had picked up at this table. First, with a quick glance, it seems that mostly everyone has roughly 4 to 600 at the table, which suggests that mostly everyone seems to be treading water at this game. Second, seat 2 and 5 are watching videos and haven't stopped since I've arrived. Seat 1 and 3 are having drinks and seem to be enjoying their time at the table so far. No reads on seat 7 really, and seat 9 is short stacking for 200 and seems to be sleeping at the table. Now some of you might be wondering why on earth I'm talking about some of these observations. The short answer is to provide some context of the things I look at for table selection. I tend to like tables with a good mix of individuals, and so far this table is looking pretty solid in that regard. Okay, so to recap the action so far in hand number 1, the middle position raises to 15, action folds to me on the button, and I raise to 45 for value and to isolate the mid position player. Sure enough, the opponent calls and we're heads up to a flop of ace-ace-4 rainbow, which should typically favor the 3-better's range here. The opponent decides to check it over to us and ends up giving us a quasi stare down, which can mean a lot of things depending on other factors. In this case, we're not too overly concerned and end up continuing here as we normally would for 35. After a short think, the opponent gives this one up and we scoop in our first pot. Thanks to Edwin S. for requesting the topic of table selection. If you have any topics or questions you'd like me to discuss, you can drop me a comment below or on Instagram. And if you enjoy watching this content, consider liking and subscribing to this channel as it helps with the growth of this community. Moving right along, 2 hands later we find ourselves in a hijack with 10-9 of hearts and open to 20. The player in seat 9 wakes up from sleeping, perks up, and shoots me a look of disgust before calling my bet. This immediately signals alarm bells in my mind as I've literally awoken the sleeping giant. And if that wasn't exciting enough, the button comes along to mix it up. As the dealer places the first burn card down, I'm telepathically willing the dealer to flop me the joint, and the dealer does not oblige with a flop of ace-queen-jack rainbow. While I did flop open-ended with the backdoor flush draw, in this case the open-ender is bittersweet as action would likely die down if a king came on any subsequent street. So while I might have some decent equity in the hand, the value proposition is relatively diminished, so I end up checking. The outlook is even more bleak when that cutoff now bets 65 into a $67 pot, while looking completely wired from all the adrenaline surging through his veins. And even if one missed all the clues of how strong this guy was, another thing to note is that this guy only started out with 200 and nearly bet half his remaining stack, with the button left to act. The button cuts this one loose and I end up folding as well. This next hand probably ranks up there as one of the silliest played of 2021. We have both the hijack and cutoff limp in, and we look down at King Queen of Clubs in the small blind and raise to 25 to thin the field a little. I definitely like the raise in this situation against these two specific opponents. But what I don't like is when the big blind cold calls at 25, and when the 2 limpers fold, I recall having thoughts of immediate regret. The flop comes King 8-4 with 2 hearts, and we start off with a standard continuation of 35. Our opponent contemplates for about half a minute and then calls. The turn comes a deuce of diamonds, which now puts 2 flush draws on the board. At this point, we're a little confused what to do here. We had initially tagged this player as a sleeping giant, though after watching him play for some more, we're beginning to think that our initial read might be wrong. We size up on this turn and bet out 85, which is close to 70% of the pot. The opponent tanks for a bit and ends up calling again. The river brings the jack of hearts, which is not that great, all things considering. Our opponent has roughly 200 behind, and I decide to set up a bet fold situation on this river with a bet of 115. With this opponent archetype, I think it's pretty silly to do this, but we're going to share both the good and poorly played hands on this channel. We not only had a lack of clarity of the board, but also a lack of clarity about our opponent's holdings, which is only amplified as we're out of position. The jack not only completes the heart draw, but also gives a hand like king jack, which we were ahead of, now 2 pair. The opponent does eventually fold, and we breathe a sigh of relief, but good results does not translate into good play. We pick up pocket queens a few times within the next hour or so. The first time it's a small single raised pot which gets called down by the opponent having queen 6 off. The second time, we find ourselves in the big blind with the button straddle. When the under the gun player raises to 35, the button calls and we squeeze this one to 110, only to get 2 folds. The third time, we decide to get a little trappy in the cutoff by flatting a $15 raise by the hijack. The big blind comes along and with a 10 high flop with 3 hearts, none of these guys have heart. At this point, we're moved to the new table as the last one broke. In this next hand, action folds around to the button who opens to 15, and we look down at ace 10 of hearts in the small blind. This is a great candidate for a 3-bet, so we raise here to 45. The big blind folds and the button calls. We're off to see the flop of 4-4-2, which shouldn't really connect all that well with either of us. But we're playing ranges here when we continue for 45. The button calls here, and my sense is that the button is getting sticky with 2 random overcards to the board. The queen of spades shows up on the turn, and while this is not the best of cards, our opponent won't necessarily have one here either. We continue the story by betting 75, and we get this one through after he ends up folding. I don't think anyone really enjoys being sandwiched, and that's what exactly happens in this next hand when I raise to 20 with ace-king in mid-position. Both the button and big blind call. With 60 in the middle, we see a flop of 6-5-5. When the big blind checks, I toss in a pretty standard c-bet of 45 to see both players fold. For this next hand, we find pocket kings in mid-position. And after an early position aggressive player raises to 20, we have a pretty easy 3-bet here to 60. The small blind cold calls of 60, and the original opener calls as well. We're 3 ways to the flop of ace-king 7 with 2 hearts. Talk about running good with drilling middle set on an ace-high board. Action checks to us, and we continue here for 50. The small blind is the only caller. When the turn brings the 2 of spades and it's checked to us, we bet 100, which is enough to put the opponent all in. At this point, we are somewhat disappointed when the opponent folds. Here are the results from today's session. We were in for 500 and out for 1137, for roughly a 637 profit over 6 hours. That's a wrap on the Vegas trip, and I hope you enjoyed the story. We might be covering a trip over to Morongo, out by the Palm Springs area, one of these upcoming vlogs. Not too sure just yet, so don't hold me to it. Thanks again for joining me on another poker vlog. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.